I am streaming this on Facebook as well. The way I have it set up is that I am spotlighted, so it should only be me appearing on Facebook, but sometimes the technology isn't so great, and sometimes it shows the whole group. It's on the links page. It's not likely to be seen by 1 million people, but just a heads up that it's possible that you may end up on Facebook. So just a heads up. I do encourage you to keep your video on. It's always nice to see who I'm talking to, give me a chance to get to know you, but it's not required. If you're not comfortable or it doesn't work or whatever it is, that's fine also. So everybody should do whatever they're most comfortable with. Okay, so my name is Rabbi Hillel Shaps. I run a program called Links. Links typically, under normal conditions, has as it's our main program. We have other classes that we've offered, but as our main program is a Wednesday night program that takes place at the Bender JCC in Rockville at this time, 8 p.m. And we have lots of one-on-one opportunities there, as well as a class kind of like this that I give for those who prefer a class or don't have a one-on-one opportunity. So that's under normal conditions when it's not COVID. When it's COVID, so we have our one-on-ones working together on their own, wherever they may be, whenever is convenient for them. And then we've been offering a Wednesday night class, continuing it. We just picked up and switched right over to Zoom as soon as COVID hit. And we've mixed it up, different series, different topics. So now we are excited to start a new series on the topic of what happened at Sinai. So this class will be somewhat introductory. We'll go through some of the basic events, and then as we go, we'll get further into it, further deeper. There's a lot to talk about. We're not going to cover everything, but hopefully you'll come away from this class with a much deeper, greater knowledge of what transpired to our ancestors at Mount Sinai. So in the year 1168 or so, the Jews of Yemen were confronted with a few simultaneous problems. The first was that a new leader had come to power in Yemen, a Muslim leader. That was a Muslim country, but this leader was someone who was oppressive, and he decreed that the Jewish subjects of Yemen had to convert to Islam, or else they would be punished or killed or who knows what. At the same time, there was a Jew who had become an apostate, had converted to Islam, and he was preaching to the Jewish communities about the greatness of Islam and how Islam had replaced Judaism. Well, first it replaced Christianity, which replaced Judaism as the true religion. And he was encouraging the people of Yemen, the Jews of Yemen, the mostly not so well-educated Jews of Yemen, to give up their Judaism and convert to Islam. And at the same time, a third problem arose, which was a false messiah arose and was encouraging both Jews and Muslims, trying to convince people and that he was the Messiah, and he actually gained quite a following. And again, this was a mostly not so strongly educated group of Jews in Yemen, and it posed a major problem for the people of the time. There was the threat of great assimilation and really the destruction of the Jewish community of Yemen. So the rabbi of the community, his name was Rabbi Yaakov al-Fayumi, and he turned to the greatest scholar of that time for help, and that was the Rambam, Maimonides. Maimonides at the time was living in Egypt, also a Muslim country, but he was on very good terms with the Muslims. He was actually the physician of the Muslim ruler, and he definitely had good connections. But besides for his connections, which helped to improve their situation, but he wrote to them a letter. He wrote a letter to the people of Yemen. It's referred to as the Epistle of Yemen. I would just call it the letter of Yemen, because an epistle sounds like an electronic pistol or something. It's a word that you only hear in academia, I think. But he wrote a letter to them, or a series of letters, and basically he encouraged them to hold to their faith. He instructed them about how in fact, Judaism is the true faith. And one of the things that he focused on was the events of Mount Sinai. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint here, which we're going to follow through. I think on your screen, my screen is different than yours, but I think now I appear very small and the screen appears big. If you want to adjust it, you usually have the option. You can, not that you necessarily want to make me any bigger, but if you would want to, then I think you could just slide it across and play with it how you want to see it. But in any event, so the Rambam Maimonides wrote to the Jews of Yemen, and included in his letter was the following. He wrote, "Remember the revelation at Sinai in accordance with God's commandment to always remember it, and his warning to not forget it." So we'll talk about that momentarily, where the Torah actually instructs us to remember the events of Sinai, and it instructs us to both with a negative commandment to not forget it, and with a positive commandment to always remember it, or to pass it on to our children. And he said, it is imperative, my brothers, that you raise your children on the knowledge of this event and proclaim it at public gatherings, its greatness and beauty. For this event is the pillar upon which our faith rests, and the proof which demonstrates its veracity. So first of all, raise your children on this. Teach your children about the events of Mount Sinai. Proclaim it at public gatherings. Speak about it. Speak about the greatness, the beauty of the event. And why? Because it's a pillar upon which our faith rests, and the proof which demonstrates its veracity. And that's something we're going to have to explore. Why is the Sinai event, the Sinai revelation, such a pillar upon which our faith rests? And in what way is it a proof of the veracity of our tradition? And then he continued, and he said, "And know, my brothers, that this great, incomparable, and unique historical event is attested by the best of evidence. Never has something like this happened before, and there will never be anything similar after it. And what is that? That is that a whole nation will hear the word of God and behold his splendor." So Maimonides seems to be alluding to an idea which we're not going to talk about so much tonight, but it's extremely important, which is the idea of mass revelation. That a whole nation would hear the word of God and behold his splendor is something unique to Judaism. We're the only religion that makes such a claim. Nobody else has claimed that there was a mass revelation. In fact, both Christianity and Islam both agree to the idea that the Jews originally were given the Torah with a mass revelation at Sinai. They just believe that they supplanted us later. But they don't attest to mass revelation. The only religion that attests to mass revelation is Judaism. So this event, the fact that a whole nation would hear the word of God and behold his splendor, is something that he says it's never happened before, and there will never be anything similar after it. How could he make such a claim? Actually, the Torah states that. The Torah states it, that it says, have you ever heard of this happening before? You'll never have heard of it, and it will never happen again. And so the Rambam is basically paraphrasing that, Maimonides, and that's going to be a very important idea. Again, it's not going to be the focus tonight, but we're going to come back to that certainly. The purpose of all this, the purpose of this great revelation, was to strengthen the faith so that nothing can change it, and to reach a degree of certainty which will sustain us in times like these of persecution and tyranny. So here he's speaking to a group of people that's suffering, a group of people whose faith is threatened. And he tells them that one thing, at least, that's very important to remember and to focus on is the revelation at Sinai. The purpose of the revelation was to strengthen the faith so that nothing can change it, and to reach a degree of certainty which will sustain us in times like these. In times, the difficult times, this can be something that sustains us. So thank God we live in a country that doesn't threaten our religion, doesn't threaten our ability to practice, doesn't directly threaten our faith, although there's always things that can threaten our faith. But in any event, this is something to turn to. And it's something that the Torah instructs us, as Maimonides alluded to before, when he said, remember the revelation in accordance with God's commandment. So the Torah itself tells us to remember the revelation. And that can be found in Devarim, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, where the Torah says, beware and watch yourself very well, lest you forget the things that your eyes saw, and lest these things depart from your heart all the days of your life. You shall make them known to your children and to your children's children. And what is it referring to? What should we make known to our children and our children's children? The day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, which is Sinai. When the Lord said to me, this is Moshe speaking. Moses speaks to the people. He says, when God said to me, assemble the people for me, and I will let them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, that they may teach their children. So we're instructed right here to remember, not to forget, make it known to our children and our children's children, the day that we stood before the Lord, before the day that we stood at Sinai, when God said to us, and Moshe is telling the people, when God said to me, assemble the people for me, and I will let them hear my words. And they hear God's words. And the Torah repeats this a number of times that we heard God's words, and we'll see that as we go. Now, another great sage around the time of the Rambam, of Maimonides, shortly after him, the Rambam lived, I put it here, from 1137 to 1204. Around the same time was the Ramban, with an N at the end, R-A-M-B-A-N, Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, 1194 to 1270. Leading Torah scholar of the Middle Ages, author commentaries on Torah and Talmud, great commentary on the Torah. So in his commentary on this verse, he tells us this verse, in my opinion, indicates a negative commandment, meaning we have a prohibition. Do not forget what happened at Sinai. And he actually writes in a subsequent paragraph, and there's also a positive commandment there to teach it to our children. And how does he describe the obligation? He says, for after the Torah instructs us to be careful with all its commandments and to keep the laws, it instructs us to take heed and protect the memory of where these commandments came from. Just previously, in a previous verse, the Torah had said, as it does numerous times, keep the laws of the Torah, guard them. So he says, right after it instructs us of that, it tells us that we must remember where these commandments came from, that we not forget the Mount Sinai event. And now he says something interesting. He says, remember all the things that our eyes saw, the thunder and lightning, his honor and greatness, God's greatness that we witnessed, his words that we heard from within the fire. Remember everything, even the details, he's telling us here. And that's a question that we can ask, is why is it so important to remember everything? I understand, remember that God spoke to us. Remember that there was this great revelation. But no, Ramban tells us more than that. You have to remember the whole event. You have to remember the thunder and lightning. Remember the great honor and greatness of God that we saw. And remember the words that we heard from God from within the fire. And tell them to your children, tell them passing on. And if you pass it on to your children and to your grandchildren, then it will be forever, because they will pass it on and they will pass it on. That's the chain of tradition that we have all the way till today, passed on from one generation to the next. So here we have a commandment really in the Torah. Don't forget what happened at Sinai and remember the details. So I think it's very fitting. It behooves us really to look into this, to investigate and try to clarify for ourselves what happened at Sinai. What did it look like, to the best of our ability to develop a vision and an image of what this great event looked like, and what happened, what did happen, why was it so unique, what was so special about it, why is it so important that we not forget it and that we pass it on to our children. And also, we know that most famously at Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments were were spoken out. So what's the story with those 10 commandments? You know, some people think that those are the main commandments. The rest are just, just recommendations, but that's not the case. There's 613 commandments in the Torah, and they're all equal. So if they're all equal, then what's unique about the 10 commandments? Why were there these 10 chosen? What's special about them? We have to investigate that. So we'll get into that. We'll talk about what they are, what each one means. We'll talk about there's a deeper meaning. There's connections between them. There's 2 tablets. What do the 2 tablets represent? Is there a connection between them? So we have a lot to explore. So it's a fun topic. Okay, so let's just give ourselves a little background as to the basic story. We have to start with the basic story. What does the Torah tell us happened before we investigate further, before we get into the commentaries? So it's really actually a little bit difficult to parse together exactly what happened, because the Torah talks about the events at Sinai in a few different places. It talks about it first in Exodus, in Shemos, chapters 19 and 20. That's Parshas Yisro. And that's where we have the first occurrence that the Torah mentions the 10 commandments. But the Torah actually mentions the 10 commandments twice, because in Devarim, Deuteronomy actually means like a second time of the law. So in Devarim, Deuteronomy is a repeating of the laws of the Torah, of many of them. And Moshe actually recounts the people what had occurred throughout their years in the desert. And there, a number of times, it tells us different parts, different pieces over and over again. It's telling us we heard God speak, chapters 4, 5, 9, and 10. And in chapter 5 is where the 10 commandments are repeated, again with details of what happened. So just to start us off on this topic, we have to just read some of the verses and tell the basic story. What's the basic story of what happened at Sinai? And for that, we're going to read some verses. And the way that I'm going to outline the events is based on Ramban's commentary. Because as I said, there are different verses in different places, and there's different opinions within the commentaries how exactly to put them in order and what happened before what and how it happened. And we may explore different opinions as we go, but just to start us off with at least one outline of the story, we'll use the commentary of Ramban. And so what I'm about to share with you is the verses and explain them as they are explained by Ramban, by Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. And I'll also mention here, now is a time that as we read through the verses, please unmute yourself, ask a question on the verse. We probably won't answer it now, but we'll give ourselves a little database of questions that we hope to get to throughout the course. And if you don't think of it now, you can definitely email it to me as well. I generally don't encourage asking questions in the chat because it's just hard for me to read in the chat and teach at the same time. So if you have a question, you could either speak it out or you can email it to me, and we can I could add it to what I hope to get to throughout the series. But please feel free definitely to unmute. So fine. Anybody want to say something up till now? Comments or questions? Okay. So here we go. So in Exodus chapter 19, the Torah tells us that in the 3rd month of the children of Israel's departure from Egypt, on this day they arrived in the desert of Sinai. So the Jewish people leave Egypt on the 15th of the Jewish month of Nisan, which is when we celebrate Pesach, Passover, the 15th of Nisan. And they're basically traveling for about 44 days from then. And they arrive at the desert of Sinai on the 1st of Iyar, of the Jewish month of Iyar, and that's their arrival. So here we go, that's verse 1 of chapter 19, and now we'll jump to verse 16. So the verses in between are important. They're the preparation for the giving of the Torah, for the revelation. Yeah.
Is it Iyar or Sivan?
Thank you, it's Sivan. That's why we have you here, Dvorah. Thank you. I was doing it in my head. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. Thank you very much. The the first of the month of Sivan is when they arrive. And then there's a whole preparation for the revelation at Sinai. And we'll probably talk about that on a different week, but I left it out for now just to get the basic story of what happened at the revelation. So verse 16 says, it came to pass on the third day, and we don't mean the third day after they arrived. We mean the third day of them preparing, which is the sixth day after they arrive at Sinai. It came to pass on the third day when it was morning that there were thunderclaps and lightning flashes, and a thick cloud was upon the mountain, and a very powerful blast of a shofar, and the entire nation that was in the camp shuddered. So this translation, by the way, comes from Chabad.org. There's different translations out there, but that's where I drew from. And here the Torah tells us just a physical description. All of a sudden, it's the day. It's the third day of preparation. According to many opinions, the 6th of Sivan. Some say the 7th of Sivan, but either the 6th or 7th. And it came to pass, and there's all this amazing stuff going on. This laser light show thunder and lightning and a thick cloud upon the mountain. And then there's a shofar sound, and they're being hit with all these different, all their senses are being hit, basically. And it says that the entire camp, the entire nation shuddered. It was frightening. It was awe-inspiring. So Moshe brought the people out toward God from the camp, and they stood at the bottom of the mountain. Now, according to Ramban, God had not yet brought his presence down onto the mountain at this point. But there was sort of this introduction of all this excitement before God rested his presence on the mountain. And at this point, Moshe brings them closer, Moses brings them closer, and they are waiting at the bottom of the mountain, waiting for God's presence to rest there. So we could pose some questions already now. What's the need for all of this excitement, the thunder and the lightning? What's with the cloud? What's with the shofar? A lot of questions that I think will eventually need to be addressed already with this. So Moshe brings the people out toward God from the camp, and they stood at the bottom of the mountain. And the entire mountain smoked, because the Lord had descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of the kiln, and the entire mountain quaked violently. So at this point, although the verse sounds like, so at this point, I guess it sounds like God's presence is coming down to the mountain, whatever that means. We don't have a full grasp of what that means, the presence of God. But in some way, God's presence was further felt at this point. And there's smoke and fire and all this stuff going on. The mountain is smoking, and it quaked violently. There was like an earthquake. And now we jump in with a verse from Deuteronomy that fills in at this point, it's speaking about the same period. And it says, and you approached and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire up in the midst of the heavens, with darkness, a cloud, and opaque darkness. So another kind of cloud or darkness. And again, we can ask, what's all this stuff? What's the burning? What's the cloud? What's the darkness? I hope that we'll be able to find some clarity in understanding what's going on. The sound of the shofar grew increasingly stronger. Moshe would speak, and God would answer him with a voice. So at this point, the shofar sound had gotten stronger, and this is verse 19, and it's introducing us to the idea that Moshe is now communicating with God. Moshe would speak, and God would answer him. Now, at this point, the Jewish people, according to Ramban at least, had not yet heard God speak to them. There are commentators, I think, that understand this verse to be referring to actually that the people heard God speak to Moshe. Moshe would speak and God would answer him, and the people heard that. I think we'll see later today, actually, that the Rambam, Maimonides, understood that way. but now we're learning Ramban. He doesn't understand that way. And all the people saw the voices and the torches, the sound of the shofar and the smoking mountain, and the people saw and trembled, so they stood from afar. So they see sound somehow, the verse seems to say. They saw voices, and they see the torches, the fire. They see the sound of the shofar. Again, well, you're not clear what that means because that's a sound. How do you see it? They see the smoking mountain, and they tremble, and they stood from afar. So at this point, they had already been given a limit to how close to the mountain they could come, but they backed up even further. It was so frightening and so awe-inspiring that they were afraid, and they knew that God was supposed to speak to them. They understood that's what was going to happen, but they weren't ready for that. They didn't want that. They were scared. So they said to Moshe, "You speak with us, and we will hear. But let God not speak with us lest we die." They said, "We don't want God to speak to us. We're afraid. We're afraid. We see how powerful, how mighty he is with all that's going on. And we're afraid. You speak to us, not God." Some understand that this verse only was said after they had already heard God speak. Then they said, "We don't want to hear God speak." Ramban understands that this was even before. Before they even heard, they were scared. But Moshe reassures them. Moshe said to the people, verse 17, "Fear not, for God has come in order to exalt you, and in order that his awe shall be upon your faces, so that you shall not sin." God has come in order to exalt you. This will raise you up. This event, this will elevate you. The occurrence, the experience of hearing God speak, that will elevate you, it will exalt you. And in order that his awe shall be upon your faces, that you shall not sin. Maimonides, in his letter to Yemen, he refers to this verse and he says, the Torah means that God revealed himself to you thus in order to give you strength to withstand all future trials, so that your hearts will not waver and you will not sin. The idea is that the experience of hearing God speak is what will carry you through. That will be a source of faith forever. And so you have to hear it, Moshe is telling them. They're saying, "We're afraid. We don't want to hear God speak." Moshe is saying, "Don't be afraid. You will be exalted by this experience, and you need to hear it in order that his awe shall be upon your face so that you shall not sin." This is what will carry you through. This is what's going to be lasting for generations to come. Someone want to jump in there? No? Okay. The Torah continues and it tells us the people remained far off, but Moshe drew near to the opaque darkness, the Arafel, where God was. And then begins the Ten Commandments. God spoke all these words saying, and actually it says in that verse, I believe, it says, and he spoke to them. This is verse, I think in that outline, by the way, if anyone's following in the outline, the verses were I had to correct them. They were worn off a little bit. I'm not sure how that happened, but I ended up adjusting them. At this point, God speaks the Ten Commandments. In this verse, it doesn't say that God said them to the people. It just says that Moshe drew near and God spoke the Ten Commandments. In Deuteronomy, it does tell us that God spoke these words, and that's actually, I think we'll see them in the next slide. The Lord spoke these words to your entire assembly. So this is Deuteronomy chapter 5, Devarim chapter 5, and this is right after the Ten Commandments appear in Devarim. It says, the Lord spoke these words to your entire assembly at the mountain, out of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the opaque darkness, with a great voice which did not cease. And he inscribed them on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. Moshe tells the people. Now, the tablets is going to be its whole own discussion. The inscription, that doesn't happen right away. But it tells us here, the Lord spoke these words. Which words? So as I mentioned, this verse follows the Ten Commandments in Devarim. So it sounds like the verse is saying that God spoke the Ten Commandments to the entire assembly at the mountain. Now that itself is going to be subject to a major discussion in the commentaries. What did God speak to people? Did he speak all 10 commandments? Did he speak only the first 2? Did he speak all of them, but they only understood the first 2? There's different opinions, and that's also something that we'll explore. and try to understand what the basis of them is and what the implications of each opinion is. Verse 20, and it was when you heard the voice from the midst of the darkness and the mountain was burning with fire that you approached me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders. So now the Torah says after they heard, Moshe is telling over what happened to the people many years later. He's telling them, he's reminding them that when you heard the voice, you approached me, the heads of your tribes and your elders, and you said, behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory, his greatness. So we've seen his glory, we've seen his greatness, and we heard his voice from the midst of the fire. We saw this day that God speaks with man, yet man remains alive. We saw what? This is a very important verse. We saw that God can speak to man and man can remain alive. It's possible to experience, we experienced it. We heard God speak to us. We saw that such a thing is possible. So they say, so now, why should we die? Why should we keep listening? Why should we continue to hear God speak? For this great fire will consume us. If we continue to hear the voice of the Lord, our God, anymore, we will die. The people don't think that they're on the level to continue hearing God's instructions. And after the 10 Commandments, they say, I think that we have had enough. And I think that was the plan all along. They were only going to hear the 10 Commandments, but they thought that they were going to hear the rest of the Torah taught to them as well. And so they say, why should we die? It's too much for us. And we want you to tell us the rest. They say, for who is there of all flesh who heard the voice of the living God speaking from the midst of the fire as we have and lived? How can somebody experience this and live? And they say, you, Moshe, approach and hear all that the Lord our God will say, and you speak to us all that the Lord our God will speak to you, and we will hear and do. So that's the famous words, Na'aseh v'nishma. They say, we will hear and we will do whatever he tells you, but you listen to the rest. We've heard enough, and you can now be the agent, the messenger to bring us the rest of the God's teachings, the rest of God's law. And then Moshe tells them, and the Lord heard the sound of your words when you spoke to me. And the Lord said to me, God said, I have heard the sound of the words of this people that they have spoken to you. They have done well in all that they have spoken. And sounds good, God says, and they don't have to hear anymore. And I will be the one to, and then I'll just speak to you from here on out, Moshe, and you'll pass it on to the rest of the people. And so basically comes to conclusion the grand revelation at Sinai. So that's the story. That's the story. If anybody wants to jump in with any questions, please feel free. Otherwise, we'll go on to the next part. Okay, so next I just want to do a quick review of the 10 Commandments, and we'll then close out with the very important idea about hearing God speak. So just a quick review, because it's always good to remind ourselves. Sorry about the formatting here. So number one, so these, remember, so in the middle there, we had that God said, God spoke the 10 Commandments. And again, as I said, there's different opinions if the people heard all 10 from God, only the first 2, how they heard it, what level of prophecy they experienced, all things that we'll have to consider and discuss. But number one, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. So this is the belief in God. Again, we'll have to understand what commandment that is. It's not spoken as a commandment. We'll have to understand that. By the way, I should mention now, so I refer to it as the 10 Commandments, and that's how we are, because that's how we're used to referring to it. The Torah actually tells us that there are Aseres HaDivarim, the 10 things, the 10 items, the 10 utterances. So the Torah tells us to divide it up into 10. But if you look at it, there's actually more than 10 things going on here, but the Torah instructs us to divide it into 10. It doesn't call it commandments. They are mostly commandments. Again, the first one isn't clearly a commandment. It just says, I am the Lord your God, although it's understood to be a mitzvah, to be a commandment, to believe in God. We'll talk about that more. So number 2 is a few commandments all into one of the Divarim. You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image. Don't make an idol, basically. you shall not bow down to them or serve them. So don't make an idol, don't bow to the idol, don't serve the idol. Number 3, you shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God. Number 4, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. To keep the Shabbos, Shabbat is the 4th of the 10 commandments. Actually gives us a whole explanation for it, for why. Number 5, honor your father and mother. So often we look at this side and we say that these are all commandments between man and God, although the 5th one stands out. Honor your father and your mother. Doesn't seem like it's between man and God. It seems like it's between a person and their parents. So we'll talk about that. And then the other 5 are more between us and our fellow man. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, and you shall not covet. So I'm just trying to familiarize ourselves with them. We're not going to discuss them now, not going to discuss them in any detail, but this will be definitely part of this series will be to look at each one, understand what it's about, compare it to the others, compare it to where it fits in the arrangement here, because there's 2 columns here. And also actually there's relationships between them going across as well, which we'll discuss as well. So 1 relates to 6 and 2 relates to 7 and 3 relates to 8, etc. So we'll talk about all those connections. So now we're ready, I think, now that we have the summary of events, we're ready to dig in a little bit and explore. And the first question that I want to deal with tonight is, why was it so important that the Jewish people hear God speak? Why couldn't they just rely on Moshe? After all, they had seen Moshe was their leader. Moshe and Aaron, his brother, Moses and Aaron, they had been the agents, the messengers of God to bring them out of Egypt. They brought about all the plagues on behalf of God. What was wrong with that system? Why couldn't they just continue in that way? And now they'll go to Mount Sinai. God will give Moshe the instructions, and he'll pass it on to the people. Why was it so important that they themselves, that our ancestors, experience God speaking to us, what we call prophecy? When I use the word prophecy, I don't mean necessarily, predicting the future. Prophecy is a word I'm just going to use to mean speaking to God. Why was it so important that hearing God speak to you, really? Why was it so important that our ancestors experience God speaking to them? So we're going to share two answers to this question. And the first is offered by the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Berlin, Lithuanian rabbi, 1860 to 1893. He's actually, both of his children have prominent, both of his sons have prominent institutions named after them. One of his sons was Rabbi Chaim Berlin. So there's the yeshiva called Yeshivas Rabbi Chaim Berlin. And his other son was Reb Meir Bar Ilan, for whom that's a take on Berlin, Bar Ilan. And that's who Bar Ilan University is named for. So the Netziv, Rabbi Berlin, says as follows. He's commenting on the verse that I pointed out earlier, where the verse says, "And you said, behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and his greatness, and we heard his voice from the midst of the fire. We saw this day that God speaks with man, yet man remains alive." This is when the Jewish people come to Moshe and they say, we get it. We got it. We heard God speak. And they say 2 things. They say, we saw that God speaks with man. They say, we saw he's showing us his glory and his greatness, and we saw that God speaks with man, and yet man remains alive. So they're mentioning 2 things that seem to both be very important. So the Netziv says as follows. He tells us that the purpose of this wonder, that all the people would merit to experience prophecy. What was the reason? Why did we have to experience prophecy? It was in order that they see and believe in 2 things that appear contradictory. There's 2 things that seem to contradict each other. They can't coexist. And what are those? Right? they would see that both are true simultaneously. They would think they can't coexist, and they found out that they could. And that is that if God's power is omnipotent, if God is really limitless, it seems impossible that he could connect to a human created from the earth. Can an unlimited God, can an omnipotent God really communicate with a mere human? Is that even possible? So, if he could, it follows that either God must be limited, God forbid, chas v'shalom, or it must be false that God actually communicates with man. They say we have this prophet Moshe, this prophet Moses. He tells us lots of things. He's been telling us lots of things, he even predicts miracles, which is great. But it doesn't seem to be possible that he's really communicating with God, or that God is really communicating with him. Because how could it be that the omnipotent God, the limitless God, could actually somehow connect with a human being, or the opposite? How could a human being actually connect and experience prophecy from God? And they saw that as a contradiction, and therefore there were two possibilities. Either Moshe's prophecy is all made up, and God is indeed great, but he does not talk to man, or God isn't quite as great as we thought he was, and that's how he could connect with a human being. But in truth, says the Netziv, though this assumption is, in truth though, this assumption is confined to human logic, when in truth it is not so. Yeah, according to our logic, if we think about things the way that we look at things, yeah, we might think that, we might come to that conclusion. But in truth, even though God is omnipotent, he can still contract himself, so to speak. He can bring himself down to our level, to our world, so to speak, and speak with man. And how do we know? The only way we know is because we experienced it. Because each of our ancestors experienced it. The only way that our ancestors knew is because they experienced it. At this event, God showed us these two things. He showed us both his honor and greatness, that it is boundless. They saw it, as they attest to here. God has shown us his glory and his greatness. They witnessed just such an unbelievable event and such a clarity of God's presence and God's greatness that they saw and understood that indeed God is limitless and omnipotent. And at the same time, we also heard his voice. We also heard his voice. These two opposites simultaneously. So what the Netziv is saying is that what was so important about us experiencing prophecy was just for the very idea of believing in prophecy and believing that it can happen, at the same time as believing in God's omnipotence. Because if we have to give up one or the other, right? They're both, we can't give up either. He's saying we on our own, it doesn't make sense to us that there could be both, that God is omnipotent and that he can speak to us, that we can experience prophecy. But we experienced it for ourselves. We saw God's greatness. We saw his honor at Sinai. And at the same time, we experienced prophecy. So now we know, we learned from there that indeed Moshe could be telling the truth. Moshe's prophecy could be true. And also that God is truly omnipotent. But the truth is that knowing that Moshe's prophecy could be true isn't quite knowing that it is true, right? And that is the second half of this experience. That is the half that Maimonides talks about, and really many of the early commentaries discuss, which is our next point. And this will be our second to last point for the evening. So the Rambam, Maimonides, in his great work, Mishnah Torah, in his section called Yesodei HaTorah, Foundations of Torah, chapter 8, he writes as follows. He says, and this is very, very important, very fundamental. The Jews did not believe in Moshe, our teacher, because of the wonders that he performed. Whenever anyone's belief is based on wonders, so the commitment of a person's heart has shortcomings, because it's possible to perform a wonder through magic or sorcery, or nowadays, technology, or right. We can these people can do amazing things, right? And it doesn't mean that they are real miracle workers. So we can't believe in Moshe's prophecy simply because he was involved in great, great miracles. Because if that were the source, well, we can never be sure, because there's other ways to bring about miracles. There's different forms of magic and sorcery. There's tricks. So all the wonders performed by Moshe in the desert were not intended to serve as proof of the legitimacy of his prophecy, but rather were performed for a purpose. The miracles that happened were not to prove the truth of Moshe's prophecy. They were just necessary for the time. It was necessary that the Egyptians drown at the sea. So he split the sea and sank them. They were right there on our toes. We needed food in the desert, so he provided us with manna. We were thirsty, so he split the rock, providing us with water. Korach's band mutinied against him, so the earth swallowed them up. And the same applies to all the other wonders. According to the Rambam, at least according to Maimonides, they were necessary. They were necessary at the time. The purpose was not to prove that Moshe is a true prophet. And he goes on and he says, so what is the source of our belief in him? The answer is, as you guessed, the revelation at Mount Sinai. Our eyes saw, our own eyes, not a stranger's. Our ears heard, and not another's. There was fire, thunder, and lightning. He entered the thick clouds. The voice spoke to him, and we heard, Moshe, Moshe, go tell them the following. There's a curious line in the Rambam, because we didn't read a verse that said that God said to Moshe, 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 go tell them the following. It could be that he is referring to the verse where it said that Moshe would speak and God would answer him. I'm not entirely sure which verse he sees this in, but we do have that verse, and a number of them where it says that they heard God speak to Moshe. So, and thus Deuteronomy relates, face to face God spoke to you. This is Moshe telling the people, God spoke to you. And it states, God did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us who are all here alive today. Right? Moshe tells the people at the end of the time in the desert, you all those who had been alive at the time, you all were there. You were there at Sinai. You heard God speak. And this wasn't a covenant made with our fathers, but with us who are here today. God made a covenant with us, and you heard God speak, and you heard God speak to me, Moshe tells them. And that is, says the Rambam, that is the source, the root of our belief in the prophecy of Moshe. How is it known that the revelation at Mount Sinai alone is the proof of the truth of Moshe's prophecy that leaves no shortcomings? How do we know that this is where we gain our proof? Because the Torah tells us in Shemos, in Exodus, it says, behold, I will come to you in a thick cloud so that the people will hear me speaking to you, so that they will believe in you forever. The Torah tells us that was the purpose. The purpose of the Sinai revelation was that the people would hear God speaking to Moshe. So not just that we experience prophecy ourselves, but we experience the prophecy of Moshe at the same time that he experiences it. Now we know that Moshe is a true prophet. It appears that before this happened, they did not believe in him with a faith that would last forever, but rather with a faith that allowed for suspicions and doubts. All the miracles, it was amazing. It was really amazing, the miracles. But there was always that doubt. Maybe he's just a wonder worker. He's a miracle worker. He's a sorcerer. Until we heard God speak to him, that closed out all doubts. And that's what the verse attests to. The people will hear me speaking to you so that they will believe in you forever. Interestingly, the Maimonides goes on and he tells us that Moshe, when he was first approached by God at the burning bush, he was actually nervous about this, and he asks, how do I know that they're going to believe me? How do I know, God, you're appointing me as your messenger. How do I know that the people will actually believe in me? And just to quote the verse, it says, actually, he says, "Hey, lo ya'aminu, they will not believe me." He actually says, "They're not going to believe me." And God says to him, he says, "I will give you a sign so that they will know that I truly sent you from the outset, and thus no doubts will remain in their hearts." As the verse says, "This will be your sign that I sent you. When you take the people out of Egypt, you will serve God on this mountain." And it's a kind of strange verse. It says, the sign that I sent you is when you get out of Egypt, you'll serve God on this mountain. So says the Rambam, says Maimonides, that this is exactly this idea. They won't have full belief in you until you serve God on this mountain, until you come to Sinai and they experience the revelation at Sinai. That's when they'll have full trust in you. But before that, not necessarily. And that was already in the exchange between God and Moshe at Moshe's first prophetic experience at the burning bush. And just to finish off this Rambam, so he goes on and he says, after he mentions that point that I just mentioned, he says, "Therefore, if a prophet arises and attempts to dispute Moshe's prophecy by performing great signs and wonders, we should not listen to him. We know with certainty that he performed those signs through magic or sorcery. He can't really be a prophet if he's contradicting what Moshe said, because we know the truth of Moshe's prophecy, because we were witness to that. We experienced it with Moshe. This conclusion is reached because the prophecy of Moshe, our teacher, is not dependent on wonders, so that we would compare these wonders one against the other. If it was only dependent on wonders, we might say, okay, this was a miracle, 8 out of 10, and this was a 9 out of 10. So which one's greater? The 9 out of 10? Okay, I'm going to go with that one. But that's not what it's about. It's not about how great the miracle, how great the event. It's about that we saw and heard with our own eyes and ears as he did. We heard God speak to Moshe, so we know that his prophecy is true. And to what can this be compared? To witnesses who gave testimony concerning a matter to a man who had observed the situation with his own eyes. Right? If you see something with your own eyes and then somebody comes and tells you that something different happened, you will never listen to them and will know for certain that they are false witnesses. If we witness something with our own eyes, if we experience something ourselves, and somebody comes and tries to tell us that it's otherwise, we won't believe them. If somebody testifies to something, we won't believe them. So if a prophet comes and tells us that something that disputes Moshe's prophecy, that disputes the Torah, so we won't believe them because we were privy to the prophetic experience of Moshe. And that, according to the Rambam, is why it was so important for us to hear God speak, because this, for us, proved the veracity, the truth of Moshe's prophecy, and for all time, as we pass that on to each generation. So we pass on the idea, the memory of what our ancestors witnessed, that they witnessed God speak to them simultaneously with Moshe, and we pass on the trust and the faith in, or the knowledge really of and the proof of the truth of Moshe's prophecy. Just to close out here, we'll close with the beautiful words of Rav Hirsch, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, the great German rabbi. He writes as follows. He says, the basis of your knowledge of God and of yourself, this is Moshe speaking to the Jewish people. He actually, in Exodus, in Shemos 19, he says, right before the SINAI Revelation, he says, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians," which is a very similar verse later, where he says, after the 10 Commandments, "You have seen that from the heavens I have spoken with you." That God really says to Moshe to tell the people, "You have seen that from the heavens I have spoken with you." Both of them you have seen. You saw what God did to the Egyptians. You have seen that I spoke to you from the heavens. Says Rav Hirsch, the basis of your knowledge of God and of yourself does not rest on belief, which can, after all, allow an element of doubt. It's not just on emunah, just belief, a leap of faith, so to speak. It rests solidly on the evidence of your own senses, on what you have seen. Again, speaking to the people. Moshe, this is his paraphrasing what he imagines Moshe is telling to the people when he says, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians. You have seen that from the heavens God spoke with you." It rests solely on the evidence of your own senses, on what you have seen with your own eyes, have yourself experienced in exactly the same words. we have in these two verses that chapter 20, verse 19 speaks of the fact of the revelation of the Torah. So you should say, you have seen that from the heavens I have spoken with you, God says. The two fundamental truths on which the whole of Judaism rests, the exodus from Egypt and the law giving on Sinai, stand firmly on the actual evidence of your senses. And as they were seen, heard, felt, and experienced simultaneously by so many hundreds of thousands of people, every possibility of deception is ruled out. So we have this mass revelation, hundreds of thousands of people, all experiencing with all our senses. And that actually already gives us an idea of what all the fireworks were about, the smoke and the thunder and the lightning, and all our senses were involved in this experience. So then the possibility of deception is ruled out. Both these fundamental truths accordingly share the highest degree of certainty, are completely out of the realm of mere believing or thinking. For those who experienced it, certainly, right? They knew it. It wasn't just believing it. They're within the bounds of what we know with certainty, and are accordingly irrefutable facts which must serve as the starting point of all our other knowledge, with the same certainty as our own existence and the existence of the physical world we see about us. When our ancestors experienced Sinai with all their senses, they saw God speaking to them. They saw, they smelled, they felt God's presence, all of that. So that experience is unique, and that experience takes you from just believing in God or just believing in the prophecy to knowing with certainty. It's as true as certainty as our own existence and the existence of the physical world we see about us. That was something that our ancestors were able to experience at Sinai, and that's something that they pass on to us, each generation, that knowledge, that experience, and that's why this is such a fundamental part of our and pillar of our faith. And on a future week, we'll discuss, how we can be certain of the veracity of the chain of tradition. That's an important question. This was what our ancestors experienced. What about, what does that mean for us today? How can we be certain of it? But for now, what we've seen, we got a little introduction into the general storyline here. We saw that there's a commandment in the Torah to remember what happened at Sinai, to remember the details, to tell it over. And we talked about how important it was that God speaks to the people directly, that the people experience prophecy. Number one, so that they believe in prophecy, and that it's possible that an omnipotent God can speak to man. That was the idea of the Netziv. And secondly, what the Rambam teaches us, and many others really, the idea that this proved that miracles alone won't prove the truth or veracity of the prophecy of Moshe. But if we experience it along with him, if we experience that prophecy and we hear God speaking to him, so that serves as a proof of the truth of Moshe's prophecy. Okay, thank you very much for joining. And I'm here to take questions. You can also email me, say hello.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Shaps. I really like the topic. Really good topic.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi Shaps.